This happened to my friend when I was in college. Her name is Sarah. Sarah hadn't planned on staying at Jenny's house so late, but that was the thing about their documentary nights. They always ran longer than expected. The tradition had started 6 months ago, after both women had gone through similarly messy breakups within weeks of each other. Jenny had texted Sarah one Thursday night, half-jokingly suggesting they should channel their trust issues into something productive, like watching a documentary. What began as a somewhat bitter joke evolved into their weekly ritual. Every Thursday, they'd order takeout from the Vietnamese place around the corner, open a bottle of wine, or two, and watch the latest crime documentary. They'd pause frequently to debate the clues, question the suspect's motives, and occasionally share their own dating horror stories. It was cheaper than therapy, Jenny would say, and probably just as effective. Tonight had been different, though. Jenny had just started seeing someone new, a guy she'd met through her yoga studio, and she'd spent the first hour gushing about how different he was from her ex. Sarah had listened, nursing her glass of Malbec, trying to be supportive while squashing down her own lingering cynicism. She couldn't help but notice the irony of Jenny falling head over heels for someone new while they were playing another game where romantic partners who turned out to be secret sociopaths.
But you'll still do our Thursday nights, right? Even when things get serious with Yoga Guy?
Sarah had asked, only half joking. Jenny had thrown a cushion at her.
Are you kidding? These nights are sacred. Besides, someone needs to keep me paranoid enough to do background checks on potential boyfriends.
They'd laughed about it, but as the night wore on and they delved deeper into their latest documentary selection, Sarah found herself growing quieter. It wasn't just that she was still single while Jenny had already moved on. It was the creeping realization that she'd gotten too comfortable in her routines, too confident in her familiar neighborhood. The documentary they'd watched that night had emphasized how many victims had been attacked in places they considered safe by people they saw every day. By 11:42 p.m., Sarah's wine buzz had worn off, replaced by a nagging awareness of just how late it had gotten. Jenny had offered to let her crash on the couch, but Sarah had declined. After all, her apartment was only 2 blocks away, a walk she'd made hundreds of times before. She needed to feed her cat anyway, and she had an early meeting the next morning that required her to have her good blazer, which was hanging in her bedroom closet. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement as Sarah left Jenny's house at 11:42 p.m. She'd lost track of time during their weekly wine and true crime documentary session, but her apartment was only 2 blocks away. The familiar walk had never bothered her before. The autumn air bit at her cheeks as she pulled her jacket closer. Her footsteps echoed off brick buildings, creating an unsettling symphony with the distant hum of traffic. The usually bustling neighborhood had emptied, leaving behind an eerie stillness that made every sound feel amplified. That's when she heard it. Another set of footsteps. At first, she tried to convince herself it was just an echo of her own shoes against the pavement, or maybe the residual paranoia from watching too many crime documentary. But there was something distinctly different about this sound. A heavier gait, an irregular rhythm that didn't match her steps. Sarah's hand instinctively went to her phone in her coat pocket, her thumb hovering over the power button. She glanced over her shoulder, trying to make it look casual, like she was just tossing her hair back. Her heart slammed against her ribs when she spotted him, a figure about 30 feet behind her. Male, tall, wearing dark clothes that seemed to melt into the shadows. The streetlight behind him created a long, distorted shadow that stretched toward her like reaching fingers. He wasn't there when she'd left Jenny's house. She was certain of that. The man's gait was odd, almost theatrical, like he was trying too hard to appear casual. Every few steps he would scuff his feet against the pavement. Deliberate sounds, she realized, meant to let her know he was there. The thought made her stomach turn. She quickened her pace, her keys already gripped between her knuckles. Just like Jenny had shown her, key through the middle finger, pointed outward. The footsteps behind her accelerated too, matching her new tempo with unsettling precision. A car passed by, its headlights briefly illuminating the street, and in that flash, she caught his reflection in a store window. He was closer now, maybe 20 feet away, and his head was tilted slightly to one side, studying her. 1 block left. Sarah's phone was in her hand now, 911 pre-dialed. Her thumb hovered over the call button, but a voice in her head, one that sounded suspiciously like the crime scene in the documentary, warned her about making sudden movements. The street ahead stretched empty and dark, the security cameras on the corner store long since broken. Their black domes stared down at her like dead eyes, useless witnesses to whatever might happen next. She cursed the false sense of security that had led her to take this route so many times before. How many times had Jenny warned her about walking alone at night? How many stories had they watched about women who thought they were safe in their own neighborhoods? The man cleared his throat, a deliberate sound that sent chills down her spine. It wasn't the natural sound of someone clearing their airways. It was a performance, an announcement of his presence. He was closer now, close enough that she could hear the swish of his jacket sleeves.
"Excuse me, miss."
His voice was surprisingly soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. It was the kind of voice that might ask for directions or the time, the kind of voice that made you feel guilty for being suspicious.
"Do you have the time?"
Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears. Every self-defense class she'd taken screamed at her not to engage. Don't look back. Don't respond. Don't give him any reason to think you're interested in interaction. Her mind raced through the statistics they'd discussed just hours ago. How many attacks began with an innocent question? How many predators relied on women's societal conditioning to be polite? She heard him speed up, his footsteps now falling harder against the pavement. The gentle facade was cracking.
"I'm just asking for the time,"
he said, his voice taking on an edge that made her skin crawl.
"Don't be rude."
Instead of responding, she broke into a run. Her boots slapped against the sidewalk, each impact jarring her bones. Behind her, she heard him curse, a guttural sound that bore no resemblance to his earlier gentle tone. And then his footsteps pounded after her. The sound of his pursuit seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the buildings that lined the empty street. She could hear his breathing now, heavy and determined. Her lungs burned as she pushed herself to run faster, her mind spinning through options. Her building was too far. She'd never get her keys out in time. The vestibule would become a trap. She didn't stop at her building's front door, running straight past it to the 24-hour deli on the corner where Marco, the owner, always kept his lights on bright. The bell chimed as she burst through the door, gasping.
"Sarah."
Marco looked up from his crossword puzzle, alarm crossing his face.
"You okay?"
Through the window, she watched the man hover for a moment before slinking away into the darkness. Her hands shook as she called the police. Later, while giving her statement to the officers, Sarah learned that 3 other women had reported similar encounters in the neighborhood. The police increased their patrols, and the neighborhood association finally fixed the broken security cameras. That night changed Sarah's habits forever. She downloaded a safety app, took a more comprehensive self-defense course, and never walked alone after dark without sharing her location with friends. The experience taught her that familiar places can transform after sunset, and that trusting your instincts isn't paranoia, it's survival. Sometimes the scariest moments aren't the obvious threats, but the quiet ones that creep up when you're in spaces you've always considered safe. They're the moments that remind us that vigilance isn't optional, and that safety is something we have to actively protect, even in our own neighborhoods. The police never gave Sarah an update on the situation, but she heard through the vineyard that guy got caught and was released. Years later, he would be now in his 80s. They found out by accident when he was caught on an unrelated charge and saved his DNA on their database. To this day, nobody knows his motive, or if he is alive or dead because nobody ever heard from him again.